My sister got Fertio Nol. That's the down payment my father gave Teresa when she bought her house in Lakewood in 2019. $40,000, wired directly to her escrow account on a Tuesday morning. He told me about it at Easter dinner that year, not as an announcement, not as something to discuss, just as a fact he mentioned while passing the kielbasa. Teresa's closing went through. 40,000. I said, good for her, and I meant it. Technically. 2 years later, when I graduated, my father called me to the house on a Sunday afternoon. He handed me a folder across the kitchen table. The same table where Teresa and I had done our homework for 12 years. The same table where he'd told us our mother was sick. The same table where a lot of things had happened that were supposed to be about family, but were mostly about my father deciding something and the rest of us adjusting. The folder had a deed in it. My grandmother's bakery. Take it, he said. It's been closed 2 years. I've been paying the property taxes and keeping the lights on because I didn't know what else to do with it. There's still equipment inside. The building's yours. I looked at the deed. Kowalczyk's Bakery, 114 Elm Street, Millbury, Ohio. Property value, $87,000. Business assets, $12,000. Outstanding liabilities, $31,000 in deferred maintenance, back due lease on the refrigeration units, and 6 months of utility arrears that my grandmother had stopped paying before she passed. Technically, I was being given something worth negative $19,000. Teresa got $40,000 in cash. I got negative $19,000 in flour dust and a 1,987 Hobart oven that nobody had turned on in 2 years. That's the difference. And my father said it with the same voice he'd used to pass the kielbasa. I want to tell you what I did with it, but first I want to tell you why I didn't say no. My father is not a cruel man. I want to say that plainly because the story I'm telling could make him sound like one, and that's not accurate. He is a practical man. There is a difference. Stan Kowalczyk grew up in Millbury, Ohio, the son of a steelworker, the grandson of Polish immigrants who came through Ellis Island in 1912 with $300 and a trade. He worked at the mill himself for 22 years before a conveyor belt accident in 2017 took 2 fingers from his right hand and ended his career on a Monday morning in November. He has a settlement that covers his medical bills and a pension that covers his utilities. He gardens. He watches the Browns lose. He is, by the measure of his own generation and class, a man who did what he was supposed to do. His theory of investment is simple. You put money where you get a return. Teresa was a nurse. Nurses have stable jobs. A house in Lakewood near Cleveland Clinic was, in my father's assessment, a reliable asset. He put $40,000 there, and he expected to get $40,000 worth of stability back. He was not wrong about the math. I had a business degree, and 3 years at an accounting firm in Columbus, which my father understood as, she works with numbers, she's fine, she doesn't need anything. He was not wrong about that either, exactly. I was fine. I had a salary. I had health insurance. I had a 401k that I contributed to at the minimum rate, because I hadn't yet decided if I was going to stay at the firm long enough to care about vesting. What I did not have, what my father did not know to look for, and what I would not have been able to explain to him at the time, was any sense that the life I was living was actually mine. 3 years of accounting. Good work by all external measures. Clients liked me. My manager had given me above-average reviews 2 years running. I was competent, reliable, technically precise. I showed up at 8:47 every morning and left at 5:50, 3 every evening, and in between I moved numbers from one column to another, and I was correct about it, always. And at the end of the day I drove home to my apartment in German Village, and I heated up whatever I had in the fridge, and I did not think about work until 8:45 the next morning. That is a description of a functional adult life. It is not a description of a life I had chosen. So when my father slid the deed across the kitchen table on that Sunday afternoon in June 2022, and I looked at the negative $19,000 and the closed bakery and the 1,987 Hobart oven, and he said, "Take it," I thought about it for approximately 45 seconds. Then I said, "Okay." He looked at me the same way he'd looked at the Hobart when he last saw it, when my grandmother was still alive and the bakery was still open. Like it was a piece of equipment whose useful life was probably over but whose replacement hadn't been arranged yet. He said, The property tax is $1,800 a year. That's on you. I said, I know. He said, there's still dough in the books from your grandmother. Not much. Maybe 6,000 once you clear the arrears. I said, I'll figure it out. He nodded, picked up his coffee, went back to watching the game. That was the entire transaction. I drove back to Columbus that evening, called June from the highway. June, I said, I just got handed my grandmother's bakery. June said, the one in Millbury? I said, it's been closed 2 years. It owes more than it's worth. She said, are you going to take it? I said, I already did. She said, okay, what's the plan? I said, I don't have one yet. She said, okay, when you do, call me. That's June. She doesn't need the plan before she's in. She just needs to know you're serious. I've known her since the 7th grade. She's the only person I've ever met who can be enthusiastic about something that has no evidence yet. I drove to Millbury on a Saturday in July. First time I'd been inside the bakery in 4 years. The building was a 2-story brick commercial space on Elm Street, half a block from the post office. My grandmother Zofia had opened it in 1971, when she was 34 years old and had 3 children under the age of 10, and a husband who was working double shifts at the mill, and a recipe for rye bread that she had brought from Krakow in 1961 and which she had been modifying incrementally every year since. I unlocked the front door. The air inside smelled like old flour and refrigerant, and the particular kind of dust that settles in a place where something warm used to happen and doesn't anymore. The display cases were empty. The chalkboard menu was still up. Zofia's handwriting, the loops of her Z's, the same loops I'd seen my entire childhood. Rye $4.50. Jala namseko, nalseko. Pierogi, dozen, $12. The prices hadn't changed since 2019. I went through the kitchen. The Hobart was still there. 1,987 model, 340 pounds, yellow cream color, worn down to something closer to institutional gray at the corners. I turned the power switch. A hum, then heat. The thing still worked. I stood in the kitchen for a while. Then I started going through the cabinets. The 4th drawer I opened had a stack of notebooks in it. Narrow, green-covered, college-ruled. On the front of the top one, in ballpoint pen, Zofia K. Bakery accounts, 1,971, 1,979. I sat down on the kitchen floor and I read them. My grandmother had kept meticulous records. Every expense, every revenue line, every note about what sold and what didn't, and what she changed and why. The early years were brutal. 1,971. Total revenue $8,200. Total costs $11,400. Net loss $3,200. 1,972. Revenue $9,800. Costs $11,900. Net loss $2,100. 1,973. Same. She lost money for 3 years before she turned profitable. But she had written notes in the margins. Not accounting notes, observation notes. Friday morning rye gone by 9 a.m. Try earlier start time. Pierogi sell better cold weather months. Chala only Jewish families buying. Find Polish church. Bring samples. She had been running experiments. She had been failing and adjusting and failing differently and adjusting again. And she had written all of it down. In a drawer in the kitchen. In Polish inflected English. In the same loops I recognized from the chalkboard. I found the 1,976 notebook. She had underlined something in red ink, which she almost never did. The line said, Year 6. First year we paid ourselves. Year 6. She had run at a loss for 5 years before the bakery supported her family. I looked around the kitchen. The Hobart, the old proofing shelves, the hand-painted tile backsplash that had been there since 1974, the smell of flour that had been embedded in these walls for 50 years. I thought about my father handing me the deed across the table. I thought about the $31,000 in liabilities. I thought about what he had said, barely worth keeping the lights on. I thought about my grandmother, 34 years old, arriving in Ohio with a rye bread recipe and a pen and a green notebook. I put the notebooks in my bag, all 9 of them. Then I drove back to Columbus, gave 2 weeks' notice on Monday, and started clearing the liabilities. August 1st, 2022. I moved into the apartment above the bakery. 2 rooms, working bathroom, radiator heat. Rent, 0, because I owned the building. First week, cleared the utility arrears. $4,200. That left me $2,800 from the thin cash reserve my grandmother had left in the business account. Second week, negotiated the refrigeration lease. The company wanted $8,400 to settle the back due. I offered $5,600 and 4 months of current payments. They took it. That's accounting. The vendor wants to settle more than they want to litigate. Third week, the deferred maintenance. The walk-in cooler needed a new compressor. $2,100. The display case lighting was out. $340 in LED strips and 2 hours of YouTube tutorials. The front window had a crack that let in cold air. $180 for a glazier. By the end of August, the liabilities were cleared. Bank account, $1,140. I called June. I'm out of money, I said. She said, how much do you need? I said, enough to buy ingredients for a test batch and pay 1 month of operating costs. Maybe $4,000. She said, I can do $2,000. I just paid my car insurance, but I have $2,000 I can move. I said, June, you make $38,000 a year. She said, I know what I make. Do you need it or not? I said, I'll pay you back double. She said, you'll pay me back when you can. Don't add pressure. I cried after we hung up. I am not a person who cries easily. Technically, I hadn't cried in 8 months. But I sat in the apartment above the bakery, and I cried for about 6 minutes, and then I washed my face and went downstairs and started a batch of my grandmother's rye bread from the 1976 recipe. It took me 4 attempts to get the hydration right. The 4th attempt, at 11:48 p.m. on a Tuesday, came out of the Hobart and hit the kitchen with a smell that made me stop moving for a moment. It smelled like my grandmother's kitchen. Exactly like it. Not approximately, exactly. I sat down on the kitchen floor and ate half a loaf standing up and did not think about anything for approximately 20 minutes. September 6th, 2022. I opened the bakery. First day revenue, $68. I had to laugh. June had lent me $2,000. I made $68. She would have been furious if I told her, and she would have told me I was doing great. I texted her the number. She replied, that's $68 more than yesterday. Keep going. I kept going. The first 3 months were what my grandmother's notebooks called the proving period. That was her phrase. She used it for bread and she used it for the business. The proving period is when the yeast either activates or it doesn't. My yeast was activating. Slowly. The regulars came first. People who had been buying from Zofia for 20 years and had been without her bread since 2020 and were, it turned out, more loyal than I had expected. Mrs. Dombrowski came the first week. She bought 2 rye loaves and a dozen pierogi and stood at the counter for 7 minutes telling me about my grandmother's hands and how she had never seen a woman who could shape dough the way Zofia could. I thanked her. She came back the next Wednesday, and the next. By October, I had 31 regular customers. Revenue, $2,400 a month. Costs, $3,100. Still losing money, but the gap was closing. My father called in November. One of his 2 calls that year. How's the bakery, he said. Open, I said. He said, you making any money? I said, not yet. He said, Mara, if it's not working? I said, it's working. It's just in the proving period. Silence. Then, okay, let me know if you need anything. He didn't ask what the proving period meant. I didn't explain it. The pivot happened in January 2023. A woman named Cheryl Oakes came in on a Wednesday. She was 52, ran the catering operation for a regional restaurant group called Heartland Table, 4 restaurants in Northwest Ohio. She'd grown up in Millbury. She'd heard the bakery was open again. She bought a challah, ate a piece of it standing at the counter, and said, who makes this? I said, I do. She said, from whose recipe? I said, my grandmother's. Zofia Kowalczyk. She opened this place in 1971. Cheryl looked at me. She set down her challah. She said, I used to buy challah here every Friday when I was a kid. My mother wouldn't have Shabbat dinner without it. She stopped when Zofia got sick. She said nobody else made it right. I didn't say anything. Cheryl picked up her challah again. She said, "Can you do volume?" I said, "What kind of volume?" She said, "I want Kowalczyk's bread in all 4 of my restaurants. Dinner service, table bread. We go through about 40 loaves a week across the 4 locations, mix of rye and challah. Can you do that?" I thought about my grandmother's notes. Friday morning rye gone by 9 a.m. Try earlier start time. I said, "Give me 2 weeks to test capacity. Then we talk numbers." She gave me her card. She said, "I'll come back February 1st. She left. I stood behind the counter and did the math in my head. 40 loaves a week, at $6 wholesale, that was $240 a week, $960 a month. $11,520 a year. From one client. I looked at my grandmother's notebooks on the shelf behind the counter. I had put them there when I'd moved in, not for decoration, just because they belonged in the kitchen where they'd been written. I pulled out the 1976 notebook, found the underlined line, year 6. First year we paid ourselves. I was in year 1. I had 4 years. I called June that night. I said, "I think I found the path." She said, "Tell me." I told her about Cheryl, about the 40 loaves, about the plan I was already building in my head, not just Heartland Table, but every restaurant in the county that served bread at the table, every hotel that offered continental breakfast, every corporate catering account within 40 miles. June said, "Mara." I said, "What?" She said, "You sound like yourself." I didn't know what to say to that. I said, "I should go. I have 40 test loaves to bake by morning." She said, "I know, go bake." By April 2024, I had 7 wholesale accounts. Heartland Table was first. Then a hotel in Findlay that had asked for a breadbasket recommendation and ended up signing a monthly contract. Then a corporate park cafeteria in Bowling Green. Then 3 more restaurants, independent places, family-owned, the kind that care where their bread comes from. Then a school district that needed sandwich loaves for its lunch program and found me through a county supplier directory. Monthly revenue in April, $14,200. Monthly costs, $8,600. Net, $5,600. I had hired 2 people, Renata, part-time, for production, and my neighbor's son Marcus, for delivery. I was paying myself a salary of $3,200 a month. I was building a cash reserve. The liabilities were paid. The refrigeration lease was current. The Hobart was still running, still clicking at 375 degrees every morning at 4:47, and I had stopped needing an alarm clock. My father's second call of the year came in March. "Same as every year, how's the bakery? You making money yet? Let me know if you need anything." This time I said, "Yes." He said, "Yes what?" I said, "Yes, I'm making money." Pause. He said, "Good." I waited for more. There was no more. We talked for 3 more minutes about his knee and the Browns, and then he said he had to get dinner started. Good. That was all. Teresa came in May. She pulled up in her Subaru on a Tuesday morning, which told me it was not a casual visit. She had taken time off from the clinic on a weekday. She came inside, looked around the bakery, looked at the display case, looked at the line of 4 customers waiting at the counter. She waited until they were gone. She said, "Dad says you're doing well." I said, "I am." She said, "I'm glad." And then she said, "We need to talk about the building." I said, "What about it?" She said, "Dad's knee is getting worse. He needs a procedure and his insurance has a gap. There's about a $40,000 shortfall." I looked at her. She said, "The building is worth more than it was. We checked. It's probably around 140 now, between the property and the business value. If you sell it." I said, "If I sell it, I lose my income and my home." She said, "You could get another job. You have your degree. You're good at accounting." I said, "Teresa, you got $40,000 in cash for a down payment." Her face shifted. I said, "I got a building with $31,000 in liabilities. I cleared them myself. I built the business myself. And now you're telling me to sell it to cover a medical bill that Dad's had 2 years to plan for." She said, It's not like that. I said. What's it like then? She didn't answer. She looked at the counter. She looked at the notebooks on the shelf. She said, Are those babshas? I said, Yes. She said, I didn't know she kept records like that. I said, She kept records of everything. Teresa stood there for a moment. She looked at the display case. She looked at the Hobart through the kitchen window. Something moved across her face that I couldn't fully read. Not guilt exactly. Something closer to realization, the particular look of someone who has just understood that a story they thought they knew was actually about something else. She said, Dad should have been more fair. It was the first time Teresa had said anything like that. I had not expected it. I said, Yes, he should have. She said, I'll talk to him about the procedure. There are other options. I said, I'll pay for the procedure. She looked at me. I said, I'm not selling. But if Dad needs $40,000 for his knee, I'll pay it. Out of the business account. Not because he deserves it. Because he's my father and I can afford it, and Babsha would have done it. Teresa said, Mara. I said, I need you to understand something. I'm not paying because the family asked. I'm paying because I chose to. That's different. You understand that? She said, Yes, I understand. She bought 2 loaves of rye and a dozen pierogi, and hugged me at the door and drove back to Lakewood. I watched her car until it was out of sight. Then I went back inside, wrote a check from the business account for $40,000 payable to the surgical center in Toledo, and put it in an envelope addressed to my father. I did not attach a note. The check said what it needed to say. I want to stop the story here and tell you what I actually think, because I've been giving you the facts, and I owe you more than facts. My father got his surgery. He recovered well. He sent me a card, a grocery store birthday card, which was not my birthday, but it was the only card he apparently had in the house. The inside said, Thank you for this. I'm sorry I was not more fair to you, Stan. My father's name. On a birthday card that wasn't for my birthday. An apology that took 4 words. I have read that card more times than I can count. I don't know exactly why. It's not a beautiful piece of writing. It's not a sufficient accounting of what I spent 2 years in the cold above a bakery figuring out. But it's the most direct thing my father has ever said to me, and I don't know what to do with that. My therapist, I started therapy in September of 2023, which is something I want to mention because I think people assume that once you've built something and proven something, the emotional part resolves itself. It doesn't. You still have to go back and figure out what the years cost you, not financially, the other kind of cost. The cost of deciding that the people who were supposed to see you didn't, and that you were going to build something anyway, and the complicated thing that happens when the building works, and you still don't feel entirely okay. My therapist asked me, in our 6th session, what would it have meant if it hadn't worked? I said, it would have meant my father was right about me. She said, would he have been? I thought about that for a long time. I thought about my grandmother losing money for 5 years and writing notes in the margins and trying again. I thought about whether Zofia, if the bakery had failed in year 3, would have been wrong to try. I thought about whether the trying itself is separate from the outcome, and whether a person's value can be measured by whether they succeeded, or whether it has to be measured by something else, something that doesn't depend on the market. I said, no, he wouldn't have been right. She said, that's a hard thing to actually believe. I said, I know. I'm working on it. Here is what I believe now. After 2 years and 7 wholesale accounts, and a recovered father and a sister who bought 2 loaves of rye and didn't ask again. The thing that was given to me was not the building. The building was just a building. The thing that was given to me was my grandmother's notebooks, her record of failing and failing differently and adjusting again, her 5 years of losses and her red ink underline in 1976. That was the inheritance. The building just held it. My father didn't know that's what he was giving me. I'm not sure it matters that he didn't know. The effect was the same. I am not going to tell you that everything worked out the way it should have, because I don't know yet what should have means. My father and I talk on the phone once a month now. The calls last about 12 minutes. He asks about the bakery. I give him the numbers, revenue, accounts, head count, because numbers are the language we share, and I've decided that sharing a partial language is better than not sharing at all. Teresa comes for dinner the first Sunday of every month. She helps with the pierogi. She is better at shaping them than I am, which I find genuinely irritating. And I told her so, and she laughed, and that was the best version of our relationship we've had since we were children. June has been paid back. Double, as promised. She cried when the wire hit her account. She texted me, "This is too much." I said, "You know what it took." She said, "Yes, I do. That's why it's too much." We argued about it for a week, and then she used the money to pay off her car, and I told her that was the exact right thing to do, and she agreed. Here is the thing I want to leave you with. Not the revenue numbers, those will change. Not the wholesale contracts, those will expand, or they won't. Not even my father's card, which sits in my desk drawer under my grandmother's notebooks. What I want to leave you with is this. My grandmother ran at a loss for 5 years. She wrote notes in the margins. She found the Polish church and brought them bread samples. She adjusted. She did not have $40,000 from anyone. She did not have an investor. She had a recipe and a green notebook and a Hobart oven, and the particular stubbornness of a woman who had crossed an ocean and was not going to be told that the thing she made was not worth making. I come from that, even when no one was saying so, especially then. January 2025. The bakery is in its 3rd year. Revenue in December, $19,400. Costs, $10,200. Net, $9,200. That is the best month in the history of Kowalczyk's Bakery, including any month my grandmother ran. I found that out by going through her notebooks and adding up her annual figures. Her best year was 1989. Revenue $62,000. She would have been proud of December. I am sure of that. I have 3 full-time employees and 1 part-time. I am paying myself $5,800 a month. The building, by the most recent informal assessment from a commercial real estate contact Cheryl introduced me to, is worth approximately $220,000 the property, plus the operating business. That is $233,000 more than the negative $13,000 it was worth when my father handed me the folder. I am not telling you this to prove anything. Technically it proves something, but that's not why I'm saying it. I'm saying it because I want you to understand what the books show. The books show that my grandmother's recipe is still the rye that people drive 45 minutes for. The books show that a challah that hasn't changed since 1961 is what Cheryl's restaurants put on the table for dinner service. The books show that a building my father called barely worth the upkeep is now employing 4 people in a town that lost its mill. The books also show, and this is the part I didn't expect, that I am the kind of person who could do this. I don't mean financially. I mean the waking up at 4:30 and the failed test batches in the winter when the heat in the apartment above the bakery didn't work and I slept in my coat. I am that person. I didn't know I was until I had to be. My father didn't know either. I want to say that not to excuse him, he should have invested in me the way he invested in Teresa, and the fact that he didn't was a failure of imagination that cost both of us, but because I think it's honest. He didn't know what he was giving me when he slid that folder across the kitchen table. He thought he was giving me a liability. He gave me my grandmother. I opened the bakery at 5:30 a.m. The Hobart clicks at 4:47 and I'm already downstairs by then. I put on my grandmother's apron. It was hanging on the hook by the proofing shelf when I moved in, and I haven't moved it, and I wear it every morning. It has her name embroidered on the chest in red thread. Zofia. On the mornings when I'm shaping the rye, I put my grandmother's 1976 notebook on the counter next to me, open to the page with the red underline. Year 6. First year we paid ourselves. I'm in year 3. I have time. Long pause. The Hobart clicking once, faintly. Then silence. To anyone listening who has been handed the thing nobody wanted, the closed business, the bad property, the opportunity that looked like a burden, I want to say, look for the notebooks. They're usually in the 4th drawer. They're usually written by someone who failed first and kept going anyway. And they're usually worth more than the $40,000 someone else got in cash. That's what the books show. Open them.